Hello and welcome back to AMP, the anime music podcast. I'm Core, your host for today. I've been playing viola for over a decade. I'm a big fan of music, been studying it and making it on my own, and also have produced a lot of analysis videos on my own covering anime OSTs. But I'm joined by my lovely co-host, that is Shabu. He is a professional music director, editor, composer. You've been working in the industry for quite a while now. I'm very excited to get into this new episode.
Thank you for the great introduction.
No, it's been a little bit since we recorded the last episode. If you're wondering why there's a seasonal related video coming out this close to the end, or rather, I think at the date that this episode is set to air, it actually will have ended. Originally, we were planning for this to come out closer to around the middle of the season, but we both got sick. Not at the same time, because that would have been convenient.
Yeah.
Which set us back quite a ways.
Yeah, we just kind of flip-flopped back and forth. I got sick like twice in 1 month, like one time at the beginning and one time at the end, and then you got sick in the middle, so it was just supremely unfortunate.
Very bad timing. But alas, we're still here to talk about this anime season. I'm excited. It's been actually quite a while for me with like watching anything seasonal. I used to be really into keeping up with all the new shows, but I kind of fell off of that. Like I'd say maybe a year or two ago, like maybe a year and a half ago. And so getting back into it's kind of an interesting experience. I don't know about for you, if you were ever like trying to really keep up with the new stuff.
I tried to for like a year, and it was exhausting, bro. Like I had a really difficult time with it, and this was it was interesting going back in, like seeing a lot of stuff. Like last time I remember I was a lot more into trying to watch everything, whereas it was a lot more like light grazing. I felt kind of like a bird just pecking at some seeds, like, ooh, an episode here, what's got a good score, like just kind of looking around was a bit more, or I guess a bit less stressful rather than like the self-imposed, I have to watch everything,
Yeah, I guess I will say, like, for the shows that we talk about here, we did like a bit of sampling of most of the shows that aired in the season, and like we each like picked individual shows that kind of struck our interest. So that's the reason for all the ones that are here, as well as some obvious choices, as will be the first show that we get into. I wanted to bring up something interesting I noticed when I was looking through and looking at all like the composers and stuff on the season. Is I feel like this is definitely not usually the case, but like every single one of the notable composers, and I consider a notable composer someone who's worked on like a lot of major shows that specifically have soundtracks that are like pretty like well received and acclaimed, at least in the Western space, since that's where I mainly am. Like all of those people are working on like at least excuse me, all of those people are working on at least 2 shows this season, if not like more. Like, which working on 3 different series like seems insane to me.
Yeah, I think Fujisawa is working on 3, right?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that he is.
Yeah, I mean, that's just insane. Like, that is an easy way to, I don't know, end up super, super burnt out. I guess it depends. So, like, different shows are going to have different production cycles, right? So I don't know when these things went into production, but, from the tidbits that you hear about anime, they are pretty crunch heavy in a lot of them. So I would imagine that working on 3 scores at one time would be pretty damn stressful and very, very demanding.
Yeah. No, I mean, I'm hoping that they're not being pushed to that much of a limit. I mean, I know something like Made in Abyss, for example, they're saying that like for this new season, it's going to be fully complete when it airs. Like they will have finished like the whole thing. So there's some cases where shows are like that, but that's seems to be a bit more of an exception than the norm.
Yeah.
But I did think it was interesting that it was like so common in this particular season.
Yeah, it's interesting. That is definitely not always the case. I'm happy to hear that Made in Abyss is doing that, though. I know, especially for other places, I can't really speak too much on the anime industry, but I know over
I'm sorry.
here.
Did I say Made in Abyss?
You said Made in Abyss. Sorry.
I that might be the case for Made in Abyss. I meant to say Mob Psycho.
Mob Psycho.
The new Mob
makes
Psycho season.
that makes more sense. Yeah, that sounds right. But I know that the last show I worked on over here was airing while we were still finishing, and part of that is because there's a lot of pressure from COVID to like, hey, we need to make money again. I know that anime output has like still been a thing through COVID, but I'm sure that it's ramped up again, and a lot of studios feel a little bit of pressure coming out of COVID, but I don't know how much.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's very interesting. Well, before we get into the show, I'm gonna make this. Maybe I'll make it a little thing, or perhaps people in the comments could leave some questions because you have experience actually working on shows and films in the industry. So like there's some insight that you might be able to offer that like not the average Joe would have. And that's, right. I think, useful for all of us to be able to understand. So this question occurred to me when I was looking at the listing for Call of the Night, and they had like a credit specifically for music selection, which I think oftentimes that is like the music editor is doing that kind of role.
Yeah.
If I understand correctly. But I was curious if there's like how often it is that the person who's like actually composing the tracks has like input into where exactly the music that they write is like being placed, if that's ever like at play.
It's I hate to do this because it feels kind of like a cop out at this point, but it depends on the production. I'll use one of my favorite OSTs as an example, right? Review Starlight has one piece, I think, from each episode scored, right? And so the composers have total input on that. Like, obviously, there's some direction there. The show I worked on recently, hour-long episodes for 8 episodes, 7 episodes. Man, it's been a month already. I can't remember. That's terrible. I had, as the music director, I had 10 to 15 minutes of music that I could allot to composers, and they scored those. Little bit different for live action stuff, which is what I was working on. For anime, obviously, you're often working off of like animatics. Is that the right term? Is that what I'm thinking of?
Or like storyboards. If it's really early.
Yeah. And so I think that it's a little bit of give and take, but oftentimes the composer doesn't actually do the legwork of like putting it into the show. And so like if you have someone who's on music selection or music editor or sometimes music director, sound director, whatever, who's actually in charge of putting the music where it needs to go, that's a really, really interesting and creative skill, especially when you get into like pushing two like cues together to make one cue, stuff like that. But I'd like to point toward the first show we're actually going to talk about. The first season of Made in Abyss has a track called Beni Kuchinawa, which I think is very clearly written for the like Crimson Split Jaw, right? And I think that Penkin probably wrote that reading the manga and knowing like, okay, this part's going to be adapted. And I'm sure that there was a music director or a translator who talking to the director, music director or something, telling him that like, okay, this scene is going to be in it. I could totally be wrong, by the way. If Penkin somehow makes his way into seeing this and this is wrong, then please correct me. But I feel like Penkin knew that was going to be in there. And so he actually wrote to the manga, I would guess. And then that would in turn make it into the anime. So it's a little bit of a give and take, especially if there's source material. And it really depends on how much like storyboard you have or animatic or, any number of those things. Like if you can start the composer working later or scoring or whatever, you often will do that. But the reason that there's so many repeated tracks is because usually you're working from a bank or like a library, right? And sometimes that library will be actually just completely unrelated to the show. That's done more over here. But I mean, sometimes the composer will just like have an idea, especially if it's something original. Like you'll get I'm sure you'll get a concept art, again, any storyboards or anything, story, main beats that need to be hit, and sometimes you'll be asked to score a specific thing, like a specific scene, like how I think Benny Kuchinawa kind of would have been done. Otherwise, it's kind of an eclectic taking of these different library tracks and turning it into something cohesive.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. I'm pretty sure I do remember Kevin Penkin saying like in an interview that like when he went to score it, he like read through the whole manga, so he had like an idea of like specific things that he was going to go for, like in terms of like what the story was and how he'd reflect that.
Yeah, totally.
That definitely makes sense. And I would also imagine that in some cases, if there's something like really specific, then the director can like go directly to the composer and be like I need this kind of thing because I know like what I want for this particular scene.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, since you already introduced us to it, let's get into the first show of the list of series we're going to be talking about from this season, which is Maiden Abyss Season 2.
Yeah.
It's great. It's really good. It's really good.
It's awesome. Kevin Penkin kicks some major ass in this one.
It's in some ways it might be a bit difficult to not be like, oh well, it's more of the same. He's just Kevin Penkin's at it again. He's bringing his really unique approach to scoring this very, very interesting, like these rich textures, but it does have like its own, I think, character. We were talking a bit before, but there's elements of it where you can tell that there's some differences to the way that he approached scoring it compared to if you listen back to the first season. I mean, like I was noticing that there's a bit more usage of like letting there be more space, where like a lot of the tracks in the first season, like there's all these like sounds bleeding over one another. Like there's one particular track in the second season that's all these little like sort of melodic clusters that happen, and then there's like a complete silence, and then another one happens that like builds a little bit and there's a silence. And I was like, oh, I could see where you could let things stop if you needed to change like the mood of the scene quickly or something like that.
Yeah, no, I like, while we're talking about this, I'm going to probably reference this one tweet that Penkin made a lot. I should have probably pulled up the actual tweet, but he says something about how he feels that he wrote a lot smarter, or he had a lot like more smarter writing when it comes to season 2. And while I think he may be like talking about actual content, which I will also talk about in a second, what you're talking about, I totally agree. It's like so much more editor friendly. And it really allows for some really nice creative edits, or just for a cue to stop at a certain point, and you don't need to use these kind of clunky fade outs or fade ins nearly as much. And I think that the score really, really gains a lot from that kind of more restraint or subtler writing.
Mm-hmm. No, for sure. It's really nice. I just kept when I was watching it, I just kept like, there's something about the way that all the sounds like happen that it's like so easy to just be swept up in. It's like there's this level of like just really great polish on
Yeah.
the Made in Abyss soundtrack that is like you hear it and it instantly stands out from like everything else. Like everything has just the right amount of reverb. It's mixed like
It's so good.
impeccably. Like I was listening, there's one track with like where there's like a violin in it, I think, if I remember right. And I feel like you can hear the space in which the violin was recorded. Like,
Yeah.
which is not something I really think about that much, but
Yeah.
like you can hear the space, which is like super interesting.
And that's like a huge strength of the chamber ensemble, like recording instead of like having a full orchestra, right? If it's the same kind of recording setup, which I'm pretty sure it's the same or similar, it's just like a chamber ensemble. And so there's not that many string players, there's not that many brass players, and you can get a lot more of the room sound because there's way less damn people in the way, you know? And so you can really hear each individual instrument to the point, like in the first season, for example, you could hear the little flute button clicks on I think Rico's theme. Don't quote me on that. I think it's Rico's theme where you could hear the flute button clicks. Maybe it was Reg's theme. Might be Reg's theme. But either way, it's a really unique sound because when people, I think of unique sounds, obviously Made in Abyss also has the synthetic element, which I'm sure we'll get into, and Penkin does a great job of curating and creating these incredibly unique soundscapes where he's got just really fascinating synths. And I know that at least some of them are made through Iris, which is a really, really interesting tool that we can talk about later if you're interested. But in terms of the actual instrumentation and stuff, I feel like you look at something like Call of the Night or even like Strike Witches, which we'll also talk about both of those, and they might have a kind of interesting sound, but they're still like not fully unique. They have unique aspects, but I find that the chamber ensemble takes something very common, which are these orchestra instruments, and puts them into an environment that we don't hear often, because normally it's like, well, if you've got the money, get the orchestra, you know, don't half-ass it. Yeah. But in reality, I think it adds so much, and you can hear the space, and it works so well for a show like Made in Abyss, where the whole point of it is like this giant pit in the middle of nowhere, and there's all this space and stuff, and combine that with Penkin's very washed out synths and interesting soundscapes, and you've got a recipe for success.
Yeah, no, I hadn't even occurred to me, but no, you're totally right on that front with like having the ability to hear like these disparate, you know, sort of solo instrumentalists playing, and the space around them is like pretty much a perfect reflection of like the narrative of these characters trekking down like by themselves into this giant pit. Like it's like really like through it's like a funny like narrative connection, but the sound also, you know, mirrors that feeling like super effectively.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me, I don't know, this is an interesting comparison to make. It reminds me of like some of the stuff that Hans Zimmer does, like with Dune, where he used for bagpipes, I think it was bagpipes, he used I shouldn't have brought this up because I don't remember the instrument used, but it wasn't bagpipes, but it was made to like sound like Dune, and what kind of instruments would have naturally cropped up on the world of Dune, you know? And he does that with a lot of his scores and makes it very cohesive. And I feel like Penkin has also done that with Made in Abyss. And it's something that I feel like goes the extra mile. And it's pretty neat.
Yeah, it's lovely. I guess one sort of thing that I put down in my notes is about the melody, the way that Penkin writes his melodies. What I specifically I forgot how to speak English.
Remix.
The soundtrack's just so good. I'm at a loss for words. There, I saved it. What I specifically put down is the melody and like the counter melodies aren't obvious.
Yeah.
Like the way he writes them, because I think with a lot of stuff that you hear, and this is not to any real issue. In plenty of cases, it's perfectly effective. When you hear some of a melody, you can sort of guess where it's going to go. If you're like really paying attention, you just like can sort of follow along and be like, oh yeah, it's going to go here. Yep. Like, because a lot of them are just following along the scale patterns and like the music that we're used to hearing. There's a lot of sort of set expectations we have for how a melody will sound. But Penkin kind of avoids that, but he also doesn't, it doesn't sound unsatisfying. It's not like, oh, I'm going to do this note because you weren't expecting it. And then you're going to be like, I was expecting something else and now I'm disappointed. It's actually, in a lot of ways, I was listening to it and it was making me think of bird calls. Because a lot of them have these very like fast and varied up and down motions that has that sense of the way bird calls go, where it's not trying to be musical in like a conventional like European notation sense or Western notation sense, but still sounds, you know, extremely pleasing to the ear. And I also think that like bird calls, that kind of naturalistic sound to it fits really well for, you know, this very, you know, natural overgrown kind of world of Made in Abyss, where it's like nature is kind of a very big element and opponent a lot of times.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think that that's a super cool point. And even when it is kind of European, I think, again, I kind of reference back to that smarter writing tweet. I think Penkin's writing has like, I feel weird saying this because, you know, he would be my senior. It feels weird for me to say this in terms of like professional experience, but I feel like his writing has gotten so much more like thoughtful, and it's a lot subtler. And I feel like you don't even need to look beyond the first cue in the first episode to see this. Like the way that he's presenting this harmonic information that we've gotten from the previous season, previous shows or whatever, and is clearly important, the way it presents it in the piano ostinato, and then has these very just gentle, like washing over you kind of string section on top of that, playing another motif kind of with that in a subtler, more like gentle way. It's less bombastic, in your face. Here's the motif. Like it's very mature, you know, and it's very thoughtful. And I just really appreciated that. I thought it was really, really beautiful, and it leads to some incredibly poignant moments.
Yeah, no, 100%. Yeah, I totally agree now that you're mentioning that, because I like when I think of first season, I think a lot of like big, messy, like bulky, chunky, like these huge chords and everything
which I love
at you at once, and it's awesome.
Yeah,
it is awesome.
Great.
But it's like, I guess it's like it's just something different and like interesting because of that. There's this like kind of evolution, because like those tracks they're big, and these new ones where it's more spacious and a bit more like thoughtful, they're like wide, like there's a lot of space to them. So it's like they both convey similar ideas, but in different ways, and while still having like the same identity.
Yeah. And the beautiful thing is you can use both still. Like they still use the pieces from the first season. And I know that we talked about this in the last episode where we talked about these shonen anime that go on forever, you know, and how they just keep growing their repertoire, right? Like they keep growing what they can put into the show, because every piece written for the show is put into that library of things they can reference, recall, or play, right? And so when they need something bigger and more bombastic, I'm sure Penkin wrote some of those for season 2 as well, but like they can always just take something from season 1, and you already see that. Like even in episode 1, I think they used To the Abyss towards the end, and to great effect. Like it's interesting because I would say that sometimes I can kind of tell when something is from the first season versus the second season. I don't think that's necessarily bad. I think it sticks out sometimes. I just have to bring up something slightly negative so that I'm not just like praising it the whole time.
Not just laying on the praise.
Yeah, just laying it on thick. But like sometimes you can notice, but I think that it actually most of the time works to the benefit of the show because A, you have that connection with those older pieces, and then B, you have the new stuff, which I think is a lot more malleable and a lot more like modular in a way where you can kind of take a chunk of it and put it here and take a chunk of it and put it here and then make like one cue out of two of these or something. And it's a lot more like moldable from the editor's perspective.
Yeah. It's just like, it's more options. It's like always better to have, more that you can work with. And that's like, I think the advantage of what he's done here is that he's giving like the music director more to work with, which is, I think it's working out pretty well, at least so far.
Dude, and the on that note, the music direction and sound direction, I feel like they were good in season 1. I think that when the show came out in terms of like music direction, sound direction, I think that Hoseki no Kuni or like Land of the Lustrous maybe had it beat on that front, but this season really just like it seems that everything that they learned from the first season and the movies has come full force, and the sound direction is gorgeous. I think I noticed it obviously from the get-go. I think the atmosphere is good. I think one show we're talking about has atmospheric sound beat on it just by a hair, but in terms of the way that the sound and the music interact with each other, it's really, really come leaps and bounds. I think it's incredible. I think my favorite example of this is Gravity. In the first episode, the gorgeous, vocal piece that's kind of along the lines of like Into the River or Hanazebe Karadina, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think it's called Gravity. That's my guess because it says gravity a lot. But that's probably the name. Is my best bet. But the sound direction is absolutely amazing. The way it cuts in and out with the Foley is honestly perfect. Like both the sound and the music end up elevating each other. And the first time I heard it, I was like, oh yeah, I like this. I don't know if I like this as much as Hanazebe Karadina, I don't know if it hits the exact same, just punch my microphone. Whoops. I don't know if it hits the same peaks or whatever, but I watched it again today. It hit me like a truck, especially when I was listening to the sound and the music. And if you just pay attention to when the sound cuts and comes back in, like the sound cutting actually almost works like a musical break. And then it comes back in like the sound will cut out and the music is just boom right in the face and you're like, damn, I just got punched, dude. Like, and it's badass. It's freaking great. And the same goes for the sound, because then you're enraptured by this gorgeous track, and then when the sound comes in and it's got this like storm and the people are talking, you're really in tune with the characters and what they're saying, how they're feeling, and the environment around them. And when that cuts out again, like you're back full force, like full focus on the music. And I think that it was just like it's a masterclass of sound and music direction. I think it's incredible.
No, great points. It's really well done. I don't really have much to add, at least on the song at the end.
Yeah.
You kind of said it perfectly. I guess actually we could get into one little thing which you kind of teased at, which is the synths, since we've talked a lot about like the way like the natural sounds and the way everything is mixed and all, but I just love the way the synths sound. Like they're all so interesting. There's a lot of texture, because I feel like a lot of shows you get kind of used to hearing a very flat sound to a synth, but these like don't sound like any synths that I've heard elsewhere. Like they have their very own personal character to them, especially those deep, like really, really low grumbly ones. Like set such a good grounding for everything else to come up around it. Uh, it's really lovely.
Dude, the synths are so good. And the way that they meld with the chamber ensemble, which I'd argue that the chamber ensemble sounds like more natural, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if we then, tying this back to something we talked about earlier, if we talk about like the chamber ensemble as the natural element, then the synth as the electronic unnatural element, you get characters like Reg or, the village, which you meet later on, right? And these machine unnatural with the natural is always kind of a constant theme in Made in Abyss. And I think that the representation in the music is really interesting because sometimes they sound separate and they sound at odds, but so many times they sound like perfectly combined and mixed. I find it fascinating that Penkin consistently uses or creates these synths that somehow don't get in the way of anything else, and they all just meld together. Like they land in the perfect sonic space to perfectly support everything else. I find that totally fascinating and something that I feel completely unable to do myself.
No, for sure. It's really impressive, especially when like the tracks get like steadily more intricate with like the layers of what's going on. It's like you're listening and you're like, I feel like this should just like blend together and like become like a mess. But everything, like each layer is still like identifiable and like takes up its own space in the sonic area. Like nothing's like butting heads too strongly.
Yeah, his texture, Penkin's texture is crazy. His texture writing is insane.
I guess is there any thing else you wanted to mention? I know you mentioned the program that he uses for constructing his synths. Something you might be interesting to talk a bit about.
Yeah, hopefully I can say this is I learned about this from his master class, but I won't say any details. I just will say he uses Iris, which is it's an offshoot of RX9, which is a really, really amazing mixing plugin where you can kind of go in and mess around with waveforms like very, very specifically. I've shown it to you a little bit before, but it shows you. I think it's a spectrogram. I think that's the right term. I don't remember. I love RX9. I use it all the time. Gonna use it on this episode. But basically, Iris takes it a step further, and you can take that waveform and you can like lasso tool any part of the waveform you want, and you can turn it into a playable synth, which allows the person to make really, really unique sounds. It's obviously not, you can't use this a lot. I wouldn't be surprised if there was only like one to a couple synths, unless, obviously Penkin would be way better at than I am. Mm-hmm. So I wouldn't be surprised if there were more, but it's a really, really fascinating tool because you can just like take a recording of something and turn it into a synth.
So what you're saying is you could conceivably take a sample of this episode and turn it into a playable synth.
Yeah, you could take a piece from Made in Abyss and turn it into a playable synth.
Layers on layers.
Layers on layers, dude. But yeah, no, it's a pretty crazy tool. And, that's just one of many tools Penkin has at his disposal to make all these things. And so it's really impressive that he's able to either create these synths or even just go through all these options and find the right thing,
Yeah, no, for sure. But, well, I think we've given Made in Abyss its due time in the spotlight.
I think I was going to say the same thing.
We better get on to the next thing or we're going to be here all night.
It's a longer episode, guys.
Do you have maybe something you want to introduce for us to begin with?
I feel like I talked a decent amount on Made in Abyss. Do you want to? So let's get into one of yours. Let's talk about Shine Posts if you're down.
All right, I am down. This is a pretty interesting one. It's done by composers Tsubasa Ito and Yasunori Nishiki, who neither of their work I'm like super familiar with. So I went
Nishiki
into
did
this.
Octopath.
Oh, that's interesting. I haven't played the game, but I've heard people are pretty fond of the music. That's very interesting. I went into it pretty blind, but I was just like jumping around, and I heard some cute little solo violin, and I was like, okay, you got me. You piqued my interest.
Core's easy. Just put some solo violin in there,
That's really all you need.
or better yet, viola.
Exactly. That's the ideal. And I found it actually, it's surprisingly, it's got some nice like highs. I'd say not everything is like the most interesting. There's a decent amount of kind of cheesy or a bit more generic sounding pieces, but I can't even really blame the show for the like composer for that, because like you kind of have to look at what they're scoring, and it's a idol show, like a very, straightforward kind of idols who aren't very good. In fact, they suck. But the manager sees their potential, and then they're gonna rise to be the best. Like it's a kind of straightforward. You know what you're gonna expect with a story like that. There's a lot of melodrama, so the way it's scored, I think, pretty, does a pretty good job of reflecting what the show itself is.
Yeah, there's a lot of idol elements in it.
Yeah, for sure. I think one thing that's interesting is that there's this use of solo violin, and there's this really bright piano. Like the piano is like so bright, and it's like that's like the one thing I noticed that felt like a bit of a unifying factor. Because when I was watching these, I was trying to listen for a little bit of like something that might be a through line through the soundtrack. And in this, it's this really bright piano, usually playing like a short kind of looped passage. And that's like all over the score.
Yeah, I actually made a note of the same exact thing. The piano is really fascinating. There's an element later that I really love where Nishiki, I think it's Nishiki anyway, like fills up space using a like reverse reverb. I think it's on the piano. I don't remember.
Yes. Actually, I did make a note of that because I thought it was like really interesting, because there are like some of these tracks that are a bit more of what I would describe as like what you think of when you think of like inspirational music, where it's like these slow, like one bar harmonic progression, piano chords, orchestra. But then there's always these little notes that are like makes it slightly more interesting, because that track, it's like there's this one section that finishes, then it plays a short piano phrase, and then that phrase is played reversed, like the audio itself is reversed, and then the orchestra comes back in with a closing passage, and I'm like, what? Like, where'd that come from? It's really fascinating whenever stuff like that comes out, or like there's other interesting notes. Like there was one track that stood out to me as sounding really like Western, like Copeland, like kind of style.
Oh, now that you mention it, okay, yeah, I didn't write that in mind, but like I know what piece you're talking about.
Yeah, it's like there's surprisingly a lot of variety. Like the highlights have a lot of like interesting like textures and stuff going on with the way they're scored. So I was impressed for kind of what I went in initially expecting. I expected something a little bit more like straight across the whole thing in like sameness.
Yeah, just cliche as hell.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But there was more sort of variation.
I think you didn't bring up my favorite one. which is this is actually not my favorite. It's just the funniest one. So, dude, sometimes I swear, like, the Japanese composers for slice of life or comedy are in this like arms race for bizarre sounds.
Oh, I know what you're
because like there's this one that sounds like a dog barking synth.
Yes.
Like, and it's like kind of a joke, but it does kind of sound like that. And I swear they're just like, oh man, they go back into the lab like finally a weirder sound than the last one, you know, like. I don't know, dude. It's very funny to me.
No, when they're going for the comedic side, I think, yeah. I specifically wrote, like, there's some really quirky sounding synths. Like, because that track, it was like, they were just, they put their, you know, you get the keyboards that have, like, the different sounds.
You get the child's keyboard.
Yeah. He just went ham on that.
Just went ham on it, dude. Oh my God. I love that. It's so good.
I guess the other thing, it's not tied directly to these series composers, but since this is an idol show, it has a lot of original music in it as well, which I figured was worth mentioning. And the song in episode 2, because I was interested enough from the first one that I opted to watch the second episode, the song at the end of that episode does like kind of slap. It's like, it's got this like city pop kind of sound to it. Ooh. But there's a lot of these little idolisms that I think are funny, because it's got like, you know, those bells that are in every idol song.
Yes, I actually made a note.
And then there's just the way that the synth sounds and how like the vocals, like vocal harmony is. Like, there's a lot of these little things that are just in every idol song, and seeing that applied to this like city pop sounding piece was pretty fun.
That's pretty fun. I actually should check that out. I didn't get all the way through episode 2.
Yeah. And then like the song in the first episode is composed by Shinya Saito, who is also the same guy who composed Tsuraiyo Days, like the opening theme for Gurren Lagann.
That's why I recognize the name.
Yeah, which I thought was pretty cool.
That is really cool.
Just a fun fact. But those were like most of my observations. Yeah. I guess like if I raise a quick critique, I mean, we already talked about some of the sameness. A lot of the mixing sounds a bit muddy. I don't know how else I would put it, but like for the interesting textures that there are sometimes, it definitely would have been like nicer if everything like had its own sonic space a little bit more.
Yeah, totally. I will say on that subject, I did like the strings, but I'm a sucker for the way that all these mixing and mastering artists do the strings over there. They're so lush and gorgeous, but I could totally see what you're talking about. I would not be me if I didn't bring up the music editing. At least from the first episode, I actually quite liked it. Like the very first scene has just incredible timing. The scene where like it's right after the concert, or like it has no music, and it's great. So you go from like the street noise and you hard cut to a very silent background in the concert, if I remember correctly, and it like just really sells the awkwardness of there being like 5 people there. And then right after that, there's a diegetic track on the radio that's hard cut into a nice OST track, and it all just flows really well. Yeah. Like, and I really respect stuff like that, because it can be difficult to get those comedic timings right, especially when you're working with these pieces of music that are already written, to get them to cut at the right times or to get them to build at the right times or anything like that can be really, really hard. And this just like flows very well into each other. And I love the first kind of concert piece, just hard cut, and then it's silent. And it's just like 3 people clapping. It's freaking so awkward, dude. It's great.
No, that's awesome.
But that first track after the diegetic one, I really liked the piano section. And then I actually said, like, I said in my notes, this OST track starts off really nice with the active piano section before the more idle elements start popping in. I worded that poorly. It's all good. But stuff like the strummed acoustic guitar and the bells with like those bell accents, and it really just sells the atmosphere. Like, okay, this is an idol show, you know, in case you were forgetting. It's not necessarily a bad thing, not necessarily a critique. Just
it is an idol show after all.
It is definitely an idol show, and it does not let you forget that often, but that's not necessarily a bad thing.
For sure. Well, I don't know if you have anything else that you want to say. I think that's like most of what I wanted to cover when it came to Shine Post.
Yeah, I think you covered like half the things that were in my notes. So, like, good job.
We were on the same page on that.
We were
one.
just like right on the same wavelength. I thought it was great. I'm glad you chose it. I will say there's one other thing, which is so you wouldn't know this, but there's a chord in Octopath, a piano chord. And it's the exact same chord shows up in this score at the end of one of the cues, and it's great. It's in the first episode. It's one of the first couple cues, and it ends with an Octopath chord, and I was like, oh, it's him. That was fun. It's always fun.
That's a really fun bit of composer's identity in there. I love stuff like that. Well, since you picked Shine Post for me, which is from my list, I'm going to pick one of yours, and I'm going to give you Summertime Render. This one's a very exciting one.
Oh, I was hoping you would say that. I have, holy crap, that's a lot more notes than I thought. All right, we're going to have to not talk about all of these. So the first thing I want to say is, like, I love Monica. I love everything Monica does. I think that they're great. And one thing that you brought up, which I thought was just a really funny way to word this, was like, this is the most credited composers for the least amount of music in the episode. And that's what I absolutely adore about this score, is the amount of open space there is. There's so much open space, and it works absolutely perfectly. Like, I remember watching the first episode, and I'm like, oh, I probably would have put a cue here. I don't know if that would have been right, you know, like, and that happened every time. Like, there were at least 2 or 3 sections where I was like, yep, I would have put a key here, and that might have been wrong. You know, and it's really fascinating because the show is really uncomfortable. And the fact that, like, there's so much empty space is always going to be uncomfortable. Even if you have something that's like, oh, I have a horror OST or whatever, it's almost not as scary or unsettling as just no music at all. Because the thing about music is that it gives you something to latch onto, right? It gives you a tangible thing to latch onto, and it gives you, like, this is the emotion you should be feeling. If you're doing your job right as a composer or whatever, it's like, here's your emotion. And the viewer says, thank you. This looks wonderful. You know? But when you have nothing, it's almost more unsettling because you're like, what is this supposed to be tense? Is this, and your mind kind of subconsciously starts racing because you kind of have nothing going, and you'll even sometimes hold on to the emotion from the last cue played. So if something unsettling plays, like cue wise, and then it goes into 8 minutes of silence, you're probably going to be uneased like the whole time unless something on screen really clues you in that you should be feeling otherwise, you know?
Yeah. Especially in a show like this, where it definitely it's like that element of suspense. I think it's like, it's almost like the equivalent of like when you're playing, like you're watching like a horror movie or something, and you know the jump scare's coming. Yeah. You don't know when. And so you're just you're waiting. It's like, because we're so used to music just always being there, that like when it's not there, it's like really noticeable, and you're like, what's going on? Like, what's gonna happen? Yeah. It's like it really takes advantage of that. And I have to give like so much props to the sound design and direction, because it's like so well done that it never, like, audially, it's never ever boring. Because that is like the danger if you don't have like constant music to rely upon, is that like your ears might get a little bored if there's not enough to keep them engaged when you're like paying attention with everything else. But there's so many like just little touches from the point of the sound design, and even the way that the sound design blends with the music is, which like we can talk about more.
Yeah.
But like it's like just so well executed that you're constantly like fully present.
Yeah, I have a note right here which I'll bounce off of that. There's it's some ways like the background sound and Foley become the soundtrack.
Yeah.
You know, in one scene the cicadas are super like carefully put in there. They very carefully fade in and out with the conversation. As the topic gets more intense, the cicadas get louder, and as it kind of eases, it kind of goes in and out as a score would, right?
Yeah. No, I also made a note of like that exact moment, because it was like so striking.
And then it plays with the OST, so like the cicadas aid in the like celeste and cymbal sounds. Like it sounds like a cymbal or a bell or something, like a gong kind of thing.
I think it might be. I was doing a little bit of research because I was curious, because it sounds gong like, but it has like a kind of unique sound. I think it actually. This is a bit of a guess, but like listening to it, I think it might actually be this thing called like a rin or a daikin, which is like this metal bowl that was used in rituals by like Buddhist monks, like in Japan.
That sounds like a very good guess to me anyways. That sounds very, I think I know the sound, and that might be correct.
But I didn't mean to stop you in your tracks.
No, you didn't. You're good. I was just letting you finish your thought, because you know I can go on for a while about this. So, but yeah, it's really interesting when the music actually does come in with this particular scene. It's really quite simple, and like it's not much to write home about, this one in particular. But when the wind chime kind of sound, or whatever you were saying, I don't know how to pronounce that, I'm so sorry. Whenever the Buddhist is it a bowl?
Yeah, a singing bowl.
Yeah, a singing bowl. Okay, yeah. Whenever the potential singing bowls come in, it really, really starts to shine. I love that. If we're assuming they're singing bowls, the kind of wind chime sounding main theme is fascinating to me, because it's clearly a motif, but it sounds random, you know? And it's so unsettling. Like when they do it in this particular cue in the middle of episode 1, it has melody to it, and it's really, really fascinating, and the texture is incredible. But at other parts where it's just like a little sprinkling of it, it's really quite uneasy.
No, it does a great job of building that tension. There's like one other thing in this particular moment, which I think is kind of awesome. There's like so much to talk about just in this really specific scene, which kind of even nails back more that like blending of the like OST and sound design, and how they kind of are almost one and the same a lot of the time, because like you were saying, a lot of this, like the soundtrack elements of it sound kind of random, almost like they're just a part of the natural sounds of the world. Has that kind of effect. And like there's one cool thing with this track, it like keeps building, and eventually, because there's the cicadas are like a primary part of it, and then as it turns more into what might be like a more standard like soundtrack piece, or at least what you might expect, those become less prominent. Like they drop down in the mix.
Yeah.
And then the way that the song that the piece ends is it harshly stops with a heartbeat sound effect, like the thump of like a heartbeat, but it's also like it's a very musical choice of sound effect, like, and you hear like simulated heartbeat a lot in like compositions as well. So it's like bleeding that line of what's sound design and what's part of the music. And I thought that was like such a brilliant way to kind of close the track.
Dude, I agree. If you are still listening and you haven't watched this show, please go watch it. It's dope. It's super sick.
It's incredible.
And everything we've been talking about. So like I guess before I hit the next point that I want to hit, I'll talk about something else very interesting about the music direction, music editing, and all that stuff, of kind of having little to no music, right? There's, I think, recorded down like 7.5 minutes over the span of 20 something minutes, which is not a lot. It may sound like a large portion of music, but that is nothing compared to other shows and stuff. Other shows have mostly music with very little downtime. This has mostly downtime with very little music. Mm-hmm. And the effect that this has on the show, on top of the things that we said, is that it slows the show down a lot. This is the longest 20-minute show I have ever watched. It's like you really feel every moment, and especially with the visuals kind of bringing up that summertime kind of slow heat, kind of long drawn out droll kind of thing. Each episode, well, the episodes that I watched so far are very slow, and they feel very long. Now that's maybe gonna turn some people off, but I think that the payoffs when they do finally hit so much harder because of this pacing, right? And that's not to say that there isn't really amazing stuff and that there's not stuff to hold on to. The show is amazing, the dialogue's great, and the art direction is awesome. I wrote down, wow, that chicken looks good. In my notes, for example. I was hungry at the time, I guess. But even, the cue at the beginning is very interesting. I don't know what word to use exactly, but like the piano cue starts off very bare bones in a good way, heavy reverb, sparse instrumentation, and it really sets the tone immediately of loneliness and instills the like right feelings in the viewers right away. So when they use the music, it's at the perfect times, right? And it's like, here's the emotion you should be feeling. Okay, we're gonna pull this away now, and then when the island comes up, it's like a little bit more relaxed and upbeat, but it's still kind of somber, and it starts off like fairly complex in terms of feelings. It's, for me anyway, it was really hard to pinpoint the mood it was going for until the main line on guitar comes in, where it's a little bit more upbeat, but it's hard to erase the emotions you have from that initial sparse piano.
Yeah. And even then, like, it is like, it gives you like that pretty guitar melody, but if I'm remembering right, it's like really short. Like they give you like just a taste of it, and then are like, there you go, goodbye.
Yeah, and it's not even like it's not even like in your face, like, oh, this is happy. It's like, this is a positive guitar melody. It's pretty, like he's still not quite sure how to feel about it, but and those kind of complex emotions carry you through as you keep going through this episode, which gets more and more unsettling as time goes on, especially when they start bringing in the wind chime, the singing bowls or whatever they are. It's really, really unsettling. And that leads me to, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to mention that I think that kind of sound is pretty interesting, because it has like this almost sense of like a ceremony, like in terms of the music, especially when it's in these more, I guess, like suspense horror elements, because there's like the gong singing bowls, which like have that, like, it's the kind of thing you'd strike during a ritual, and the chimes, like it very much sets that sense of something spiritual and otherworldly going on, which I think
totally
is
agree.
a very, very effective choice.
Yeah, and then all of this culminates. So I'm finally going to talk about it, but all of this culminates. So all these emotions and shit culminate in this giant payoff at the end of the first episode, right? It is it's like the most classic Monica track that you could ever think of, with the child choir singing that very Monica brand like music chunks, and it hits so hard along with what's happening on screen, which I don't know if we care about spoilers or not, but if people haven't watched it at this point, please go watch it. Just
please, it's please,
good, because I'm about to spoil it. But like, when all that shit happens where she gets shot and all the music's playing, like, bro, that hits so hard, especially after the episode feels like so long and it's like really, lengthy from the lack of music, to have so much music and to have such clear music. Like, this is music kind of music. I don't know how else to word that. Very musical music.
I love musical music.
Yeah, me too. The payoff is crazy, dude. Like,
no, it's incredible. No, there's all these like different like textures and stuff that are getting built up too. So it's like it's just a really rich moment, and I guess that really sells. It's like the like climax turning point. Like, it's where everything like shifts from all this suspense. There's finally this moment of like, this is happening, and the soundtrack really gives it that sense of presence, I think.
Yeah, it hits hard, dude. It's crazy. It goes crazy, as the kids say. I will say that while the music direction is phenomenal, like, I cannot say enough how great it is. The amount of restraint shown, and in the first couple episodes at least, the amount of restraint shown to not put music in certain places is amazing. I will say my one minor critique is that the editing, I think, is sometimes just okay.
Mm-hmm.
If you listen for it, you can hear where some tracks fade in and out, like manually. I don't think most listeners will clue into that. I think that some listeners probably can't hear that necessarily. Probably people watching this kind of podcast would be able to, but it's generally covered up really well with the scene changes or noise from the show. But I will say that, like, in terms of some other scores or stuff coming out, the editing on some of these tracks is not the best out of all of them. It's still good. It's still fine, but if I had to give a small critique, there's not many, and it's pretty much just this one. That would be it.
I do want to say there's one delightful little thing. I feel like most of the soundtrack is kind of unidentifiable. Like, you wouldn't like nail it down as being like, oh, this is like X thing. But there is one thing that stood out like immediately, not in a bad way, just in a way, which is when the vocals come in, the like wailing vocals, very like, it's like Bulgarian folk like sound. It's like immediately I'm like, oh, Yuki Yuna. It's like,
no,
Keiichi Okabe, like, he's doing his thing.
He's back at it again. No, I totally agree.
Tricks.
And some people, I'm sure, would view that as a negative because, some people want the music to disappear into the show, and that's clearly something where it will stick out if you know what to look for.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm a sucker for it, so I love it.
Yeah. And I think that it's used effectively because it's pretty sparing. It's only in like moments of really intense emotion, and generally it's connected to like the like moments in like the plot of the show where there's this like mystery being like directly confronted, which is this more sort of supernatural element. Mm-hmm. And I think that otherworldly sound of that kind of vocals like taps in exactly to that. It's like in the similar way to the more like low key but like spooky and like unsettling sounds, how those have a sense of like something's like wrong. This like taps into that but is like more intense and like in your face for like when it's like really urgent.
It's very chilling. It serves a similar purpose, but like as the like the singing bowls or wind chimes, like that sound, it serves a similar purpose to that, but like cranked up to 11. Where it's that
100%.
supernatural. Yeah, that supernatural kind of clues you into the like what's going on in the show.
There was one track that I thought was kind of cool, where it used it was like a piano with echo on it, where it utilized that like echo as a part of like building up the track, that I thought was pretty interesting.
Oh yeah.
It was like reverberating, because there wasn't really anything else that I can think of too much that like that in the episodes that I watched, but that one like stood out. I thought it was pretty interesting. And there is quite a bit of moments where it utilizes that like long, like trailing reverb to really like dwell on those like aftertones and stuff, which is like another element of how it lets you really sit with the space and that sense of unease.
Really sparse and like open. Even the score itself is very open. I love that. I'm interested to see what happens when more action gets introduced, because I have unfortunately seen like one clip on Twitter, and so I know that there are action moments. I'm very curious to see how the music direction goes with that later on, but we'll see.
100%. This is definitely a show that I recommend. It was really good. I'm excited to watch more of it and to hear more of it, because it was pretty stellar.
Yeah, I think that's it from me on this one. What about you?
I think that's about all I had to say.
All right, let's get into Call of the Night then. That is your remaining one, I believe.
Okie dokie. Here we go. Call of the Night. This is scored by Yoshiaki Dewa, who is another individual I'm not as familiar with in terms of his work. I picked this one specifically, not necessarily because it's like my favorite of the stuff that I sampled for the season, but I did think it was pretty interesting in what it's going for, because this is like really heavy in on this like hip hop, like electronic style, a lot of emphasis on these little like repetitive synth patterns with these drums and percussion elements, and I thought that was kind of cool that it's, barring a couple locations, it's pretty much that style through the whole thing, at least again in the 2 episodes that I watched of the show, which I always find it interesting when, you know, I go into a show and it has like a very distinct musical identity that's pretty different from like what you might expect or from a lot of like other stuff airing around it.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I think that when I watched it, I was like, this is interesting because it's a very, very heavily electronic score. And it's not in a way that a lot of like, oh, this composer's doing an electronic piece. Like, it sounds like an electronic artist writing electronic music. At least to me, it sounds like a native writing electronic music. I also will say that this is the only show where I'll mention this. The OP is a banger, and those bass lines own.
It does go hard.
It goes so hard, dude. That upright bass line. Woo.
Has me getting down in the club.
I'm getting down in the club. I've never gotten down in the club in my life, bro.
I'm getting distracted.
Sorry.
I'm just imagining busting it down to the Call of the Night OP. I think I feel like there's a lot of really interesting and cool stuff in this, and it's like almost there. That's like how I feel about a lot of the elements of this score.
Yeah.
Is that I get the sense that if it was like it was punched up a little bit, this could be like really, really stand out.
Yeah, I did not want to be the first person to say that, but that's exactly how I felt as well.
Because there's there's some stuff like the hazy detuned synths. I really like those. Whenever he's using those, like those have such a fun and like unique sound to them. That like every time those kick in, I'm like, okay, you got me. That I always like. Something interesting I think is like the mixing. He really uses the stereo space. Like there's a lot of like panning and like hard panned like elements of the melodic of the tracks themselves.
Yeah.
Some stuff like there was one track that had like reversed synth reverb piano and like panning percussion and it, like interesting sounds like that. And I think what would for me improve a lot of them is like one thing is I would love for there to be a little bit more to them, because most of the tracks, and I think this might have been maybe an intentional choice in terms of how you're balancing your time, because you only have so much time to produce the music you're going for. And one thing I noticed is it seems like they opted to go for short, simple over, but a really wide variety. I noticed that it felt like the soundtrack, like the score was changing like every 30 seconds. Like the track was changing to something new. So, and I think that's possible because a lot of the tracks are like 1 to 2 synths, percussion, and maybe like bass. Like there's not too much happening. And similar with like the melodic, it's usually very sort of loop based, which very much in the style it's going for. So I'm fine with that. That works. But I think if there was a bit more complexity to the tracks, it would definitely help it.
Yeah. You mentioned percussion. That's actually something that I found myself wishing it wasn't in there a lot of the time. Because there were a lot of these cues where they're using it, and the percussion just sounds so at odds with what's happening on screen, or it like interferes with the dialogue, and it gets kind of muddy. The music's also really loud in the show, which I think is fine sometimes, but I think some of these cues would have worked really, really well, or at least much better without percussion. I think my main gripe is that everything is so clear and kind of aggressive or harsh. Like at least in the first episode, the first half, I feel like at odds with what I'm supposed to be feeling watching this laid back, like nighttime adventure, where there's like these kind of tense moments, or it's kind of aggressive, like upbeat, a little bit too in your face, and like I'm kind of at unease. Where I think that if some of these percussion were taken out, especially because the percussion is always very punchy and clear, I think that it could have taken the energy and the like emotion of the scene more in line with what's on screen. But I don't know how they handled all that stuff. If they had the stems or whatever, then they could have done that in editing. But yeah, that's something that was like one of my kind of main gripes with it. It's hard to put into words, I guess. But
yeah, no, I can see what you mean. I mean, I do think that I get the sense that it was maybe going for kind of that like lo-fi style, which is, you know, there's a big emphasis on like the presence of like those like noticeable like drum elements, but it still captures an extremely like relaxing and chill like vibe and atmosphere. So I'm curious like how like if you were trying to go in and like capture that lo-fi sound with like this kind of show, like what you might like do differently, so that it's not like interfering but you still have that kind of sense to it.
Yeah, it's mainly in the first episode that I'm thinking of. In the first half, there's like some trap beats and some more like punchy, aggressive, upbeat things. There is a straight up lo-fi track later on, which I think the percussion is fine. I think that if they actually had made the earlier tracks maybe less punchy, or if they had taken out the drums and instead replaced it with some kind of more washed out synth that kind of keeps the time, or if it gave out like a synth ostinato that kept the time or something else, it wouldn't be quite as aggressive in terms of. I think that the problem is for me is that sometimes it conflicts with the voices, especially if the voices are talking more slowly and then the percussion is kind of going offbeat very quickly. The percussion is sometimes in the same like frequency range as some of these words, and it can be a little bit, at least to me, like unsettling. I don't know how else to explain. It's like it's not comfortable for me when I think what was on screen was supposed to make me feel comfortable.
Yeah, you're like, you better start rapping, or like, what's going on here?
I'm confused.
This preamble is really long.
Dang. Woo, yeah. All right, any day now.
I think one thing is, this is like, because for me my main two issues is like, I just think like, yeah, it could be a bit more complex in the sound, and like your point is pretty good about how I think the like percussion in some cases is really up front and center in ways that are a bit distracting. I will say it's not every track, but there's some tracks that the melodic lines have a very particular kind of structure to them that is a little bit grating when it's repeated like so aggressively. The way I notated it, because I was like, how do I write this down in a way I can remember? I wrote it. It's the pocket full of posies. It's that like, it's like it sounds like a kid like na 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 na. That like a lot of the melodies in these more like upbeat moments have that structure, which I think it can work, but it needs like a bit more to it, like a couple more moments of reprieve or like variance.
Yeah.
And that's kind of like, I don't want to be too negative because I picked it specifically because I think it's interesting.
Yeah, I think it's very
because I like what like they're going for, and I think there was like a lot of potential to it. So it's like I want to like give it some credit for like going for something that like stands out, and I want to see like this like again, but like a bit improved upon, a bit more interesting. Because like I mean, I think if you want to see an example of this in a more like top tier like level, you look at like the Megalobox score.
I was gonna say the same
which
thing.
I think has like a lot of similar choices and elements in how it's like starting from a bass line, but like hits each note like much better.
Yeah, I totally agree. And what you said, this is why this works so well, is because when I said aggressive, what you just said is exactly what I was trying to say by like aggressive or harsh or like in your face, is that it's that repeated kind of stuff, or the percussion or whatever is very almost distracting. But I also want to say I think that this score is really interesting as well. And I do want to see more of it. And I think that this show, if I had to guess, it feels like something where it'll hit its stride, like episode 3 or maybe episode 7. Like it will start hitting its stride somewhere in there. But like, I think that part of it's a music direction thing as well, because there's a track at the end of episode 1 when he's having the flashback, they're sitting on the bench, that I think would have actually worked really well with a little bit of doctoring at the beginning of the episode and would have been the exact emotion they were going for. And I think that that kind of thing, the more score we see, it'll be more clear, like if they should have used this score or whatever in a different spot. But I think that that might be some of the issue. Also, along the lines of music editing, I like this and I don't like this at the same time. But the show really likes hard cuts on the music. It does a lot of hard cuts, which I actually do like. It keeps the soundscape fresh and offbeat, but it sometimes goes a little bit too far with like how in your face the music is, and then it becomes more noticeable than it should be.
Right.
You know, if your goal is to be invisible, then they failed at least a little bit, because obviously your goal is not always to be invisible in a comedy if you're cutting the music at a certain time. Anyway, I'm not going to get into that, but like I think in some of the places where they wanted to be invisible, they weren't. But I do like that they really were dedicated to trying this, and I think it worked in the places where it worked. It was just in the couple of places where it didn't, it was a little bit noticeable. To heap some really great praise onto the show as a whole, though, I think it has incredible ambient noise. And that like emotion that the ambient noise gives you, or at least gives me, of the city and the city sound and like soundscape at night, like when nothing is happening and everything's kind of, dead, was so relaxing. And that's exactly what I feel like they wanted from the music. But the soundscape was great. I think that there was only one or two instances where a noise sounded like it was a little too close for where the person was, but that's a very, very minor note, and no one's going to notice that. I think that the soundscape was amazing.
Alrighty. Well, I think that's about all I got for Call of the Night, unless there's any final notes you want to mention.
Call of the Night it out, I think.
I guess we'll call it on Call of the Night and move on to one of your selections, which is League of Nations Air Force Aviation Magic Band Luminous Witches. This is a Strike Witches spin-off series.
All right, that's it. That's all we needed. I just picked it so that you would have to read the whole title out loud. No, I'm joking. This probably will be our shortest one, just because I don't have as much to say about it. I picked it mainly because I love Fujisawa. I'm a huge Fujisawa fan, so I knew that I had to pick one of them, and I did not like the other ones quite as much. I will say the reason I picked it was because of the very first cue, and then when I kind of watched more, I thought that it's good. I think that Fujisawa probably had a fun time writing this. But I like that it kind of goes for this old school, like romantic or like golden age of film style score.
Yeah.
And I think that that's pretty unique. And I get why they went for that, because it's this funky, like magical girl, but period piece, but there's Dunkirk involved, and it is bizarre. Strike Witches fans are gonna come after me for that. But like the first cue, I feel like I've heard this cue a lot. It's this kind of repeated chromatic string line. There's a mix though where you can really hear some classic Fujisawa in like the higher strings in particular. And then like you move on to the second cue and, continuing, there's like, it's a very traditional score in terms of instrumentation, but some really fun melodic turns that I wasn't expecting. Something like Fujisawa loves to do, which he uses in this, is this huge crescendo to break into pianissimo. He does that all the freaking time, man. But I don't know. I'm a sucker for it. So
Yeah. No, it was I just thought it was like a lot of fun to listen to. Because Fujisawa, he's just like a great orchestrator. So like you have all these just really pleasant like melodic lines playing around with each other. It's got that, like you were saying, classical orchestral sound. In fact, I was like, it feels like something out of like a John Williams score, which is also maybe just because of how much it's borrowing from like styles of like various classical pieces. And I wanted to say, because there's like, it's one of those things that's like, it's well executed, but I don't have a lot to say about anything super specific. But I think the metatextual element of it is pretty interesting. Because like the story of this, well, Strike Witch's basic overview, it's like it's like set around, it's like World War II time period. And then there's a lot of analogous stuff to the real world, but always slightly renamed. So instead of Britain, there's Britannia, stuff like that. And then they're fighting, instead of fighting like another country, they're fighting these aliens that are invading. That's basic gist of it. But in the plot of this show, instead of focusing on the people fighting the aliens, it's focusing on a lot of people who like weren't good enough for the military or like ex-military or whatever, and they're working to be a part of like this musical group that's basically doing like keeping people's spirits up in the wartime. And all the characters are like, at least in their names, are direct references to famous musician, or at least notable musicians and actors from around the world who were active during World War II. So like their commander, Grace Stewart, is a reference to James Stewart, who's a star of It's a Wonderful Life. And there's like a lot of other things like that, which I thought was really interesting. And because they're all from, like, the whole point is they're from different countries, I think it also let Fujisawa play around with these different styles, because you hear like a kind of Russian sounding sound.
Yeah. It's
Russian sounding piece when the Russian girl comes in, German sounding piece when the German girl comes in, Finnish. Like it touches on all those little things. So I thought that was like a really neat little thing going on.
Yeah. Well, on that note, I love that all of this different stuff and all these different styles are, you know, they're kind of modernized, but they're dressed up old fashioned. You know, there's like some of them do sound very authentically old fashioned, but there's one that's like the sneaky clarinet, that classic sneaky clarinet sound. I feel like it's when the cat or the dog is like running around and chasing something. I don't remember exactly what's going on, but it's like got this sneaky clarinet sound, but it sounds modern in the way it's written and the way it sounds, like mixing and mastering and stuff, but its dressing is old fashioned and it sounds kind of like something you'd hear in like Tom and Jerry or something, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
In that same cue, like, because I'm me and I gotta bring it up, really clever music editing, because it clearly, if you're like attuned to it and listening for it, then you'll be able to hear it, but you can hear that they forced the cue to repeat. But you would never be able to tell. It sounds natural. So that's pretty good. It's not entirely seamless because you can tell. But it's pretty well done. It's clever. It's clever, and I liked it.
Minus 10 points.
Minus 10 points. It was noticeable. No, it was good. And sometimes, you know, you're working with what you're working with. I think that this score must have been a lot of fun to write. That I specifically wrote that in my notes, that like when I was listening to it, I think it was a lot of fun, because so often, like recently, you have to write modern music as opposed to these kind of more lush and beautiful kind of sweeping melodies and stuff. And when you get to write something like this, you get to write in that golden age of film kind of style. And I think that that's very, very fun. I will say the Amazing Grace section was really funny to me. Nothing wrong with it. It's totally fine. The orchestration is gorgeous. It was just bizarre to me.
It's awesome. It's the magic alien comes out of her, jumps on her head, and then she gets a halo, and she gets a tail, and then she sings Amazing Grace in Japanese. It's awesome.
It's great, dude. I was watching it. I was like, this score's pretty good. And then I came out, I'm like, bro, what the fuck am I watching, dude? What is this, bro? I think the string writing is gorgeous. I think the wind and string writing is gorgeous. I think the brass is okay sometimes. Something interesting is that I think that one cue in particular sounds like it might actually layer patch and live strings. I could be wrong. It's one of the staccato sections. And if that's the case, that would be really interesting and would kind of be in line because you're going for this really big orchestra sound. And so if you can't hire a really big orchestra, or even if you can and you want to fill out even more space, then you can layer it with patches. And if you layer patches with live instruments, they will instantly sound a lot more realistic. So you can kind of get away with that. Mm-hmm. I thought that was pretty interesting.
That's definitely a clever technique if that's what was utilized. Well, I guess that's the main ones, but I do want to direct us just to one last little moment of appreciation, and that's the delightful CHIMIMO. It's two me's, yeah. CHIMIMO. Is it?
Is it CHIMIMO? No, I thought it was CHIMIMO.
It's CHIMIMO. It's CHIMIMO.
CHIMIMO.
I just misspelled it in my notes. Like Kota Kobayashi. This is just a cute, really cute show that I doubt anybody is talking about. But the soundtrack is adorable.
It's so good. It's, along the lines of something like Kobayashi's Dragon Maid. Very, very comfy. Lots of fun instruments like recorder, melodica. Nothing crazy for Japan, but fun to point out their usage in these kind of, specifically in these kind of offbeat, fun-loving shows. Think Kobayashi and such. Lots of staccato accented instruments like marimba, xylophone, staccato, harp.
So much recorder.
So much recorder. But it's just it's so like pleasant, right?
Yeah. There is like, I think the fun thing is there's this bit of like contrast because it's like a lot of what you would expect where it's like slice of life recorder, like do like stuff, and then when it gets more intense for like comedic beats, then it does like kind of your standard like rock electric guitar kind of sound.
Yeah.
But then there's also like this really fun like jazzy elements. Like there's just a musical montage in the first episode. There's actually like 2 points at which it just literally lets the music like be the main element. And both points it's like really focusing on this like jazzy kind of style. And it also has a main theme like that recurs multiple times throughout the first episode, because it's sort of introduced and then it shows up as like this theme that gets passed around between like the brass and the strings in the montage, and then like the violin does kind of like a bit of a solo with it, and then it shows up again just in the OST in like another form. And then it's sort of reshaped when it shows up like another time later on. So I was like, oh, that's cool. This bit of recurring melody going on throughout the whole thing. It's fun.
Yeah, it's such a fun score. It's pretty short too, right? The episodes are shorter.
I think it's actually standard length, though it does feel like something that would be shorter.
Okay, I had a fever dream about that. Never mind. I think it's worth checking out for the score and the cute aesthetic at least. It's fun. It's very fun.
Dude, that track with the flute, like going off that bass, it was fire. It was
Dude,
fire.
it's straight heat, bro. It's so good.
Well, that's I think that's about time. This was a lot of fun. It's really
Always is.
interesting to go through all these shows. Definitely let us know just anything that you're interested to hear us talk about, or any questions that you might want us to like discuss in the episodes. And also let comment down below like what like soundtracks from this season you thought were the most interesting, or what you liked, either from like the shows we discussed or maybe some stuff that we didn't, because obviously we didn't have the time at our disposal to talk about everything. Nor would we want to, because that would be very overwhelming. But I'd love to know like what you all have to say.
Yeah, please comment stuff that you want us to talk about, because unlike Core, who is an endless wealth of creativity, I am creatively bankrupt. And I need ideas for when I need to come up with topics. So please comment about what you'd like to hear us about, or anything that you liked in this episode.
Let us steal from you, please. We're desperate. We're very desperate.
I would never say this otherwise, but I have to make this joke. Ring the summertime rendering singing bell, and that was bad. I should have left that one in the drafts. Anyways,
sorry, if you tweeted it, you can't.
Oh, no. All right, we'll see you guys next time. Have a good one.
Have a good one.